I immediately go over to my good friend Eleanor Crook. Eleanor trained in sculpture at Central St. Martin's and the Royal Academy, and she makes figures and effigies in wax, carved wood, and lifelike media. She has made special studies of anatomy and sculpted anatomical and pathological waxworks for the Gordon Museum of Pathology, the London Science Museum, and the Royal College of Surgeons of England. She exhibits internationally in both fine art and science museums. She learned the technique of forensic facial reconstruction modeling from Richard Neave and has demonstrated and taught this to artists, forensic anthropology students, law enforcement officers, and plastic surgeons, as well as incorporating this practice in her own sculpted people. So Eleanor, we're looking very much forward to your lecture.
And thanks for that lovely introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. And is that visible to everybody in the right size? Anne, is that looking correct to you? Okay, great, thanks very much. What an extraordinary machine this picture is. And I'd like to thank Angelo and Andrew for those two amazing talks. And I'm sure that all of us who've just sat listening to those and looking at the slides really feel that we're living in the future. In a sense, we are. It's the future of previous generations, and we are future beings to them. And you may think, looking at my slide, oh no, she's going to drag us back to the past. She's going to drag us back to old technology, old history, and all that heady excitement of new technology and future possibility is temporarily off the menu. The reason I think it's useful at this stage to take a look at the predictions and imaginations of previous generations is it gives us perspective on what it is possible to imagine and what we might not quite yet be imagining. For example, if Angelo and Andrew's presentations last for 2,000 years, the people who'll be looking at them will be in the same position as we are today, looking back at the predictions of some of the writers that I'm going to talk to you right now about. Before I turned to sculpture, I used to study classics. I was an archaeologist, and I did some digging on Hadrian's Wall and dug up the hobnails out of 2,000-year-old Roman soldiers' sandals. And that sense of objects traveling in time is one of the things that got me so interested in sculpture and the possibility of being able to make things that you can send into the future, like messages to future generations. Writers have done this too. It's surprising how little prediction of the future we receive from the ancient world. But what there is vivid. And I'm going to introduce a few examples that maybe you haven't read in the past, or maybe you haven't associated with the history of science fiction. For a start, the ancient world had its own sense of parallel worlds, and the parallel worlds tended to be the worlds of the gods and of the dead. The underworld was thought of as being an actual place with a historical geographical position. There are several entrances to Hades in the ancient world that I've spoken to on other occasions. And the sense of time was very closely related to one's own sense of family, to one's ancestors and descendants. The ancient cultures I'm talking about tended to have cults of ancestor worship and certainly valued the wisdom of previous generations and didn't think of it as outdated in a way that perhaps we do now. And so the ancestors needed to be consulted for important military and political decisions. The first sort of science fiction, well, speculation piece of writing I wanted to talk to you about is this one. This is a medieval drawing from an edition of it that's come down to us, but it was a writing by Cicero, who was There are his dates. So an early Roman public figure who wrote extensively on law, philosophy, history, really was a writer on any important public topic, and was a sort of public figure, a lawyer, a politician. Very rarely wrote about metaphysics and very rarely speculated about the nature of the universe. And his most religious piece of writing, he wrote quite late in life, and he presented it as a dream. It's part of his De Republica. We don't have all of that book, but we have this because it was of interest to later cosmologists. He tells the story of Scipio, who was one of the family who, famously fought the wars in Carthage as part of the Roman Republic's imperial adventures in North Africa. And he tells the story of how Scipio, the grandson of the most famous Scipio of Carthage, had a dream where he consulted his grandfather for advice, I suppose, on political and strategic questions. So he went to sleep. He dreamed that he traveled out into the universe, which is unusual in an ancient Roman book about consulting the dead. Normally you would be going down to the underworld, but in this one, Scipio heads out into the universe, and this is how he describes it. I gazed at all the heavenly bodies that surrounded me, and among the fires of heaven I saw a brilliant ring of light, the Milky Way. I saw stars that could not be seen from Earth, and their size was almost beyond my comprehension. Of all the heavenly bodies, the smallest was the moon, reflecting the sun's brilliant light. The Earth too was dwarfed by the stars. And suddenly, man and all his follies and adventures and discoveries seemed insignificant. I suddenly felt embarrassed and ashamed that the Republic's mighty empire, the Roman Republic's mighty empire, was an insignificant dot on a tiny planet. Now, the cosmos that he dreams has the Earth at the center, and it has the planets, the sun and the moon, rotating around the Earth. And there is this very sort of visual awareness of the Milky Way. He meets his ancestor. His ancestor gives him military, strategic, and ethical advice. And the odd thing I find when I read the whole dream of Scipio is that the travel into the galaxy, the travel out into the Milky Way, raises ethical questions in the mind of Scipio. He suddenly says, well, if the afterlife is out here in the galaxy and out amongst the heavenly bodies, what point is there carrying on our tiny, insignificant life on Earth? Why should we not just commit suicide and render ourselves to eternal interstellar happiness? Whereupon his ancestors, takes ethical disagreement with this and says that actually, while you're alive, Earth is your sphere of influence, Earth is your job, if you like, and to leave Earth would be unethical and wrong before your allotted time. So here we have a notion of really a kind of space travel, or a relationship of the human body with extraterrestrial time and extraterrestrial space, surprisingly early and in sharp contrast to hell-like images of an underworld guarded by a three-headed dog and gods and goddesses. Now the next, oh yes, and I just wanted to show you some of the medieval illustrations to Scipio's dream, which show you this Earth-centric universe with the Milky Way and the rotations of all the different planets. There is Scipio talking to his grandfather and receiving military, strategic, and ethical advice. And this, of course, is the Milky Way that illustrator and that Cicero is really thinking and writing about, and the sense of distance and the sense of scale that it gives when you imagine being out there looking back towards the Earth. Now, a second prose work which speculates about what it's like beyond the earth, and what kind, and also has, looking back to Richard's lecture earlier this morning, also has a certain set of speculations about alien anatomy, is a book called The True History, ironically, by an early writer called Lucian, who's probably from Syracuse. And Lucian was an early bestseller. We don't have many novels from the ancient world, and it was a literary form that developed later. But Lucian was one of its early proponents, and his novels and his satirical writings were quite widely circulated. So I think of him as one of the early science fiction bestsellers, a very popular and influential text. In The True History, it starts as a sort of tall traveler's tale about a man who travels and voyages, works as a soldier and a sailor, and decides to go on an exploratory journey. This is the technology that he has. This is the technology that he can imagine that could take him further than any human being has traveled before. It's a ship of its period. This is probably a Victorian illustration from a late edition, but this is what's described in the text. It's a ship that travels and travels and travels across the Mediterranean and gets picked up by a waterspout, which is where a tornado picks up water from the surface of the sea. And instead of falling back down to the sea, his boat just continues to climb and climb and climb, and he ends up on the moon. So Lucian is imagining what life might be like on the moon. And on the moon, there are alternative beings. And given that we are considering what it is to predict a future, or what it is to imagine another world, or a parallel world, or somewhere you might go, the moon is described very much in terms of what Lucian would have known already. And it's a kind of imagination that I call the collage imagination. Let me tell you what I mean. When he gets to the moon, he finds that the people of the moon, just like the people on Earth, are fighting territorial wars with people from other astral bodies. And this picture shows that he predicts that the people of the moon will be fighting with the people of the sun for the right to colonize Venus. In trying to imagine how you get between the stars, he imagines something physical. He doesn't imagine rocket propulsion. He doesn't imagine flight as such. He imagines enormous interstellar spiders weaving enormous webs. And you see in this old engraving how this has been envisioned. So the challenges of the new world that he's visiting are very much pictured in terms of things that he already has seen and can sort of extrapolate and imagine out further. He also imagines a parallel anatomy for the creatures who live on the moon, beautifully illustrated here in an 18th century edition of this text. But I'm going to read you how he imagines the anatomy, and you can compare it with what you were hearing from Richard this morning about alien anatomies. And I warn you in advance that Lucian is somewhat preoccupied with how his lunar beings are going to be procreating. So there's some physical anatomy here. There are no women on the moon, and they'd not even heard of the word women. It's a place where men marry men and men give birth to children. Before the age of 25, men act as wives, and thereafter they assume the roles of husbands. I saw that pregnant men did not carry their unborn babies in their stomachs, but in their calf muscles. Conception doesn't take place as you might expect. Instead, each man has a hole in the hollow of his knee. After the act, the man's calf muscle begins to swell until the baby is ready for delivery. When it's due, the calf is cut and the baby is taken out, quite dead. And then a moon person will gently breathe life into the baby's mouth. If this sounds unusual, I'll tell you another way they go about procreating. They have beings called arboreals, or tree people, who are brought about through a most unusual process. A man's right testicle is cut off and planted in the ground. Over time, it grows into a large tree made of flesh. It's shaped like a giant phallus, and when I first saw such a tree, it reminded me of the tale of Priapus. The tree has branches and leaves and eventually bears fruit in the form of giant acorns. When these fruit eventually ripen, they're harvested. Men cut them down from the tree, slice them open, and inside them are more little men. When a man grows old and dies, he doesn't become a corpse. Instead, he gradually turns to vapor and becomes at one with the air. And then he talks further and further about their bodies, which are sort of ridiculous and monstrous all at once. And it becomes hard to tell whether this is a genuine prediction or a genuine imagination, or whether he's being satirical. He says, adult moon people have beards that grow not from their chins, but from their knees. They only have one toe on each foot and no toenails, and a cabbage leaf tail. They use their bellies as pockets and can open and close these pouches. Inside their bellies, there appear to be no intestines, and their children are able to climb into these pouches and keep warm, which is an extraordinary prediction of marsupials, such that unless somebody had made it to Australia in that period that we don't know about, Lucian really couldn't have known. So you do get these odd prescient predictions sometimes and wonder where they come from, or if they're just coincidental inventions. Again, Lucian has in his text quite a lot of speculation about looking back to the Earth from the moon and seeing how small and insignificant it is. And it becomes very important to him to think of a sense of scale. When I was mentioning earlier this sort of idea of a collaging imagination, it's a question that has come up in some art project classes that I've been teaching lately, which is, what is your imagination? Is your imagination a sort of generative engine that can speculate the future? Or is it actually a collage machine that takes all sorts of elements from things that you already have experienced and puts them together to form new hybrids and new beings? And I think that's an important question for any kind of scientific prediction, whether it's anatomies of the future, technologies of the future. Is what we're imagining genuinely fresh and where things are going, or is it a kind of rearrangement of what we already have? It seems an important question to me whether we can do more than just rearrange in our minds elements that we already have. Some of the most fantastical, inventive visuals I know are from the large paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. And when I really come to look at them, I think, yes, it is inventive and the detail is astonishing, but actually every single element on this is a familiar object that you could paint from observation. And it's the putting together that's original. It's the disjunctive and uncomfortable juxtapositions that are original about it. It's not otherworldly, it's this world rearranged. So we have the foot, the armor, something from a plant, something from a fish maybe, something from some weaponry, toad legs, human buttocks, a very strange and discomforting conjunction. Again, when you look at Bosch's imagery, you can recognize every element as, beautifully observed, beautifully chosen from the repertoire of existing objects. It's the combination that is so disruptive to your sense of what you've seen before and what's normal. It's a collage. Incidentally, this little detail from the Garden of Earthly Delights could be an illustration for a book on evolution, and in that sense has this feeling of prescience, the theory of evolution not being formulated and written down until the 1860s, and yet here we have seagoing creatures that seem to be emerging onto the land and seem to be developing from fish to limbed creatures to land creatures, and then climbing up and presumably eventually becoming arboreals themselves. So I'd like you to just hold in mind this idea of Bosch as a way of imagining and speculating that's a kind of collage, a kind of putting together of images we already know. There's another example of his almost a still life turned into a set of living creatures. And secondly, I just wanted to make a comment on the use in the ancient world and in the Renaissance world as well, the use of this huge sense of cosmic perspective, looking back down on the earth as a place where tiny, insignificant things happen. It's used in several of these literatures to make a moral point. That the sense of distance that an imaginary astronaut gets from the world makes everything seem suddenly very small and rather vulnerable. I've always got that impression when I was looking at this sort of God's eye view of the battle of Alexander the Great at Issus, this God's eye view painted by Altdorfer in the German Renaissance, with these vistas that just disappear. There's the moon over here, the sun rising here, the moon rising over here, and these vistas disappearing into the distance, and the tiny fraught lives of humans acting themselves out on the planet. People have said, in fact, how on earth did Altdorfer get that cosmic angle on it? And is that, in fact, a visionary painting that came to him as though he was, you know, either speculatively or somehow visionary astral traveling above the earth? But if you've traveled in that part of the world and been up the mountains, you do get these rather God's eye view vistas down into the human landscape, which again gives this real sense of perspective of the tininess of human endeavor in the great scale of creation. One of the most entertaining and fun examples of speculative fiction and imaginary anatomies used to give a sense of proportion and scale to human affairs is in this book by the great Voltaire called Micromegas. I highly recommend this as an entertaining speculative fiction read. To cut a long story short, Micromegas is an enormous giant who comes from the star Sirius, and he travels with his friend from the planet Saturn to the Earth, where he discovers that there are living beings, but they're incredibly tiny. This picture shows him picking up a human ship, a whole whaling ship, just on his fingernail. It's this tiny little ship that he finds. And he has a conversation about this, the find of these tiny people on this tiny ship, which has a sort of philosophical bent. And again, it's making a moral point about the importance of humans and the importance of human affairs from the point of view of how an extraterrestrial being might see us. And for that reason, I think it's an important point in the history of science fiction. It's this idea of being seen by beings from elsewhere that aren't gods, they're real beings. So I'm going to quote a little bit for you just to whet your appetite for how entertaining it is. What marvelous skill then did it take for our philosopher Micromegas to pick up this ship and look at these miniature minute creatures? When Leeuwenhoek and Hartsucker first peered down their microscopes to see the seeds from which we are all born, they were not as astonished as Micromegas was when he saw humans for the first time. He felt great pleasure upon seeing these little machines move. He watched their actions. He cried with joy as he put a microscope in the hands of his Saturnian friend. "I see them," they said in unison. "Do you see them carrying their little burdens?" As they spoke of the pleasure of seeing objects so new, their hands trembled and they feared losing the tiny beings. The Saturnian looked at them, thought that he saw some of the creatures making love. "Aha," he said, "I am seeing nature at work." But he was deceived by appearances, something that happens whether we use microscopes or not. And then the next bit has another of these weird, prescient bits where you think, gosh, it's as though he saw something into the future. The giant tries to talk to the people, but he realizes he's going to deafen them. So, to all intents and purposes, he seems to invent the gramophone needle to reduce the volume of his voice down to talk to them. The Saturnian burned with impatience to enter into conversation with the atom-sized little men, but feared that his voice might deafen them. He had to reduce the volume, so he fashioned a device resembling a small toothpick, placing one end in their mouths and the other end close to the ship. He placed the ship on his knees and the crew on his fingernail, and spoke into the tiny needle. And he spoke thus: invisible insects to whom the Creator has given life, in the abyss of the infinitely small. I appreciate that he has deigned me to discover secrets that might otherwise have seemed impenetrable. Maybe my kind would not even deign to look at you, but I do not despise anyone, however tiny, and I offer you my protection. So reading that, I think you get this very clear sense of perspective that it's imagined that there could be beings out there in the universe and forms of life that we would scarcely recognize, just in terms of scale, let alone in terms of molecular constitution or extraordinarily long lifespan. And I appreciate in Voltaire this active imagination that can see the limitations of what's human. Now, the next big science fiction novel that became extreme, I'm getting out of order, but there is a vision of the Earth from space painted by Bosch, which is shown as a strange glassy sphere. And it's mysterious because we know he knows that the world is bigger than this. But this perhaps is our human experience of it, that we have a small sphere of experience and a small sphere of influence. We know that there's plenty, plenty beyond, and yet its zenith contains what we know. Now, another famous and very successful science fiction book of its period, and one that's, I think, been very influential on later writers, was this Man in the Moon book. I'm showing you there the French edition for its illustration, by Francis Godwin, who was a bishop, actually, and a man of the cloth who wrote religious books and philosophy, but also this best-selling novel. He imagines a man of his time. The man of his time is a Spaniard and an adventurer. And the hero is involved once again in colonial adventures. He voyages to the West Indies. He takes part in Spanish army maneuvers, and his love for traveling and his desire to go further than anyone else leads him to design well, it's hardly a spaceship, but it is something that can lift him further than humans have ever flown before. And the way he invents it is he just harnesses a flock of swans, imagining that each of them has the strength to lift a certain weight. And if you harness them all together, you can train them to lift something as heavy as a man, which I think is quite optimistic. He himself was of Henry VIII proportions, and it would have taken a great number of swans to get him off the ground, let alone towards the moon. But these are the visualizations of a spaceship from the Renaissance period. And again, it's spaceships imagined in the only terms and frames of reference that the people of the time could imagine. Propulsion to fly by things that can already fly, but magnifying their power. So this chap flies to the moon, and he finds there again a whole civilization, very recognizable civilization, a civilization that has diplomacy and wars and colonies, just like the countries and nations that Godwin would have known down on Earth. And this is where I think his book takes an unusual turn. He is the one whose early writings are sometimes spookily prescient. Sorry, I'm flipping forward my slides too soon. Let me just describe to you his idea for the biology of these lunar creatures. I saw myself surrounded with the kind of people most strange, both for their feature, demeanor, and clothing. Their stature was their stature was most diverse, but generally twice as high as Earth people. Their color and their countenance very pleasing. Their clothing hard to describe. I didn't see any kind of cloth, silk, or other stuff to resemble what we know clothes are made of. Nor do I know how to describe the color of them, being they were all clothed alike. It wasn't black, white, yellow, red, green, nor blue, nor any color composed of these. It was a color never seen in our earthly world, and therefore never to be described by us. And I found myself rolling these phrases around in my head, and I was wondering, you know, it's almost like a prescience of some synthetic iridescent fabric or some synthetic iridescent cloth that somebody of the 17th century wouldn't have seen before. He spends some time also describing the kind of technologies they have available, and his descriptions of communications technology really do have an unsettling closeness to the truth that we now experience with our technology and our phones and so on. He says when they're communicating, you'll see them seem to fly from place to place in the air. You'll be able, without moving or traveling, no movement at all, to send messages in an instant, many miles away, and receive answers again immediately. You'll be able to declare your mind presently to your friend, being in some private and remote place of a busy, prosperous city, with a number of such like things. You'll have notices of a new world, such that all the philosophers of former ages could never so much as dream of. Now, imaginary technology changes. Here's imaginary technology by a man who's never seen electricity. Add electricity and you get this imaginary technology. This is from another entertaining book called The Unpretentious Philosopher, Guillaume de la Folie. And in this book, an extraterrestrial visits Earth and has to be helped to get back home again by finding the ingredients for his flying machine. It's a bit like the Star Trek dilithium crystals. He lands and he doesn't have a supply. And you can see in the illustration and in the verbal description in the book that he has this, you know, this is a technology from the age of electricity. There's friction. He's using static electricity between two rubber balloons, which are generating light, heat, movement. And even so, you know, the onlookers are absolutely stunned and amazed by this. So pre-electric technology, post-electric technology. Another innovation that you get in Godwin the Bishop's book is that the universe he describes is not the ancient universe where the Earth is immovable and everything rotates around it. This book is from the time of Nicholas Copernicus, and although Copernicus's teachings about the heliocentric, the sun-centric galaxy are banned by the church, and although his book was completely discredited and suppressed, the theories were out there, and Godwin includes them in his work. He doesn't quite dare to say that the universe he discovers with his goose spaceship has the Earth orbiting the sun, but he does say that the Earth does move, and he says that things rotate around the Earth and that the sun doesn't have the relationship to the planets that other people think it does. He's using the physics and the astronomy that was available to him. He also is quite astute about gravity. He makes it clear that the Earth has gravity, but that the moon has less, and that the beings who live on the moon use this low gravity as a mode of transport. They can jump further and they can accelerate their jumps according to the laws of physics, if you assume that the moon is a weaker magnet than the Earth. And so he incorporates contemporary science in a way that was quite daring at the time. I think he probably got away with it because he was a bishop and people didn't like to argue with him. Because remember that Copernicus himself wasn't allowed to publish his book. Things were printed like this that discredited the Copernican universe, saying that it was light as air and that the weight of truth lay with the Ptolemaic universe, with the Earth at the center. And there's the hand of God deciding. And poor old Copernicus didn't see his book published until he was on his deathbed. So I can see Anne with her hand up, and I realize that it's time for me to just wrap up. I'll just show you
a little bit time, Eleanor, just to remind you a little bit.
Okay, you can see. I'll just show you a couple more of the spooky things then in Godwin that really show how a prescient person can predict the future. His moon people talk with notes, like musical notes. They don't use words, they use tunes. And in his published book, he actually shows the tunes and translates them and says, oh, this is how they say this is how they say that. And there are the little tunes. If you can read music, you can probably whistle them. It seemed very prescient to me when I thought of that memorable and lovely scene in the science fiction movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the humans communicate with the spaceship using that little tune that you might remember from the movie. I can't quite find it on the original publication, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. If I were a better singer, I would sing it for you, but you wouldn't thank me. Also prescient, well, I read out to you the little bit about the forms of remote communication and being able to sort of text your friend immediately and exchange your thoughts, however remote in the world that you were. And although we occasionally see paintings from the Renaissance period where somebody appears to be touting an iPhone, it is in fact a letter. And these dreams of future communication are eerily prescient. They might be wishful thinking, but this is where you really feel the hand of the person reach into the future and bring something back to show to their contemporaries. And I think one of the reasons we feel, and listening to the first two talks this afternoon, I felt it myself, we're living in the future, is because we have this weight of prediction and excellent speculation behind us by great science fiction writers, of course, not just from the ancient world, but particularly from the period since the Enlightenment. We feel that their predictions are being proven true one after another, after another, after another, or that they are appearing in a slightly changed form. And it gives you a sense of moving through time. Just a tiny example of that. Godwin's hero exchanges gifts with the King of the Moon. And in those days, in the Renaissance, if you were an ambassador, you might exchange gemstones or precious jewels. It would be a very typical diplomatic gift. Well, the moonstones that he is given have three names. They're called Polyastis, Macrus, and Ebolus. And when you read his description of them, he's describing smart materials. It's very creepy. The first one seems to be a piece of radioactive stuff that radiates heat and has immense power in a very small capsule. I've shown you there a piece of plutonium glowing away. The second piece of material he receives is phosphorescent and it creates light. And the third piece of material he receives, I don't know if we have it yet, but it creates positive and negative gravity. If you put it close to yourself, you become heavier or lighter as required. So I don't know if we yet have a smart material that can do that. I'm sure some of our colleagues here can tell me. So to round up, you are, those of you who are lucky enough to be in Riga today, and I so wish I was there with you. It's painful to be in a shed in Berkshire. You're sitting in a beautiful medical museum, a new anatomical museum. You're surrounded with specimens of contemporary and old technology and specimens of creatures from the past. These are some from our Hunterian Museum in London. And I invite you really to go into the collection and stand in front of some of these old specimens, maybe, you know, a kitten from the 18th century. I don't know what you have there, or a skeleton from the 19th century. And you can declare to them, you know, I am your future being. I'm living a life you couldn't possibly have predicted. I have means of communication and technologies that just were not available to you. But what would you have imagined for me? You know, you can have this sort of dialogue with beings from the past. Just like when we make our artworks, we're having a dialogue with beings from the future. The paintings that I've put in your exhibition downstairs that people have kindly hung for me, I just wanted to close by very quickly showing them to you because they're speculative and they are examples of collage imagination, really bringing together elements that we know, and also examples of the idea of specimens traveling into the future, anatomies being recombined into possible future anatomies, anatomies growing other creatures and developing other beings inside them, anatomies appearing in environments that we feel are familiar but could barely imagine on other planets, meeting creatures that they barely recognize as creatures, experiencing time in unusual and disjunctive ways, time changing faster as we travel, and embryos experiencing future intimations and future wisdoms, and the very specimens in the museum as a kind of time travelers, specimens that normally their bodily existence would have ended centuries ago, but because of our techniques of anatomical preservation, we've projected them into the future somehow. Imaginary anatomies, this sort of idea of collaging anatomies to produce a third object or a third speculation. And other beings getting to see different vistas perhaps in the future. And two pieces that unfortunately and totally in line with the topic of our exhibition have become lost in space, I'm afraid, thanks to Brexit and customs. You may not see two of my little time travelers, being this imaginary anatomical astronaut and this one, which is somewhere lost in space currently with his asteroids for eyes. So thank you, Anne, and thank you all for sharing a little reminiscence about how the future used to be.